There are 196 countries in the world. 25 of them are very rich, defined as having an average wealth per person of over $100,000 a year. They are. But far more countries are quite poor, and some, which we're considering here, are very, very poor. These are the 20 poorest countries in the world, where the per capita wealth is under $1,000 a year, or under $3 a day. Every country is now more or less on a path to growth, but the poor ones are growing very, very slowly. If Zimbabwe continues at its current growth rate, it will qualify as a rich country in 2,722 years. What we want to know in this film is why some countries prosper and others stagnate, so that we can understand what rich countries are doing right and get a better grip on the challenges and hurdles facing poor countries. There are basically three factors that determine whether a country will be rich or poor. The first is institutions. Institutions are beyond important. Broadly speaking, rich countries have good institutions, and poor ones have very, very bad ones. The correlation between poverty and corruption is direct. The richest countries in the world are quite simply invariably also the least corrupt ones. And the most corrupt countries are also the poorest. When countries are corrupt, they can't collect enough taxes to get the good institutions they would need to escape the poverty trap. Half of the wealth of the world's poorest 20 countries goes into offshore accounts. Lost revenues in these countries totals between $10 and $20 billion a year. Meanwhile, without an adequate tax base, poor countries can't invest in police, education, health and transport. Now, a more generous way to look at corruption is that it's really a case of clan-based thinking. Say you're hiring someone. In the rich countries, you're meant to do so simply on merit, interviewing lots of candidates, then picking the best one, irrespective of any personal connection. But in poor countries, under the sway of clan-based thinking, that approach would itself be seen as corrupt. It's your duty to disregard the so-called best candidate from an anonymous bunch in order to pick someone from your own team, your uncle, your brother, your second cousin, the guys from the same tribe. As a result, poor countries don't allow themselves access to the intelligence and talent of the whole population. There's a second thing that keeps countries poor: culture. What goes on in people's minds, their outlooks and beliefs. A striking statistic pops up here in relation to religion. If there's one generalization you can make about religion and wealth, it's that the less people believe, the richer they stand a chance of being. 19 of the richest countries in the world have 70% or more of their populations saying that religion is not at all important to them. The exception here is, unsurprisingly, the United States, which manages to combine great religiosity with huge wealth. More on that in a second. And conversely, the poorest nations in the world are also extremely believing ones. Here's how many people think religion and the supernatural is deeply important in the following countries. In the world's poorest country, simply everyone is a believer. Why is belief quite so bad for wealth creation? Because in general, religiosity is connected up with the idea that the here and now can't be improved. So you should focus on the spiritual and look forward to a next world instead. It makes quite a bit of sense when you live here. In the rich world, on the other hand, people are generally great believers in their capacity to alter their destiny through effort and talent. Incidentally, to explain the anomaly of the United States, religion seems not to slow down economic growth here because it's a particular sort of religion, an overwhelmingly Protestant and exceptionally materialistic kind. The American God doesn't want you to think of building the New Jerusalem in the next world. He wants it here and now, in Kansas or Houston. There's another big factor that determines the wealth and poverty of nations: geography. Poor countries are overwhelmingly located in the tropical regions. This isn't a coincidence. Life is, in many ways, simply far, far tougher there. The problems begin with agriculture. Tropical plants are generally a lot less packed with carbohydrates. Poor countries have worse soil too. Also, and perhaps surprisingly, a tropical climate can be disadvantageous to photosynthesis. Historically, a key determinant in the likelihood of societies growing rich was their possession of large domesticated animals, such as horses and oxen, which liberated a huge part of the workforce from having to plough by hand. But in tropical Africa, domesticated animals have throughout time been devastated by a further appalling scourge, the tsetse fly. This small fly, exclusively present in Africa because of its heat and humidity, knocks out animals on an enormous scale, making them sleepy or inactive, and has had a profound effect on the ability of Africans to develop technology, increase agricultural productivity, and amass wealth. It isn't just plants and animals that suffer in the tropics. In the middle latitudes, humans are open to a terrifying array of diseases, including 100% of low-income countries are affected by at least 5 tropical diseases simultaneously. The magical temperature, which has helped to make rich countries rich, is 16 degrees centigrade. However superficially unpleasant, that drop below 16 degrees as autumn starts to bite is quite literally a foundation stone of civilization. Geography also encompasses transport, and poor countries are on the whole very badly connected. Landlocked Bolivia and semi-landlocked Paraguay are the poorest nations in South America. Africa has only one major navigable river, the Nile, and hosts 15 landlocked nations, 11 of which have average incomes of $600 a year or less. Not coincidentally, the poorest country in Asia, Afghanistan, is also landlocked. Then there's the matter of natural resources. Natural resources like oil or precious metals can be real trouble, and paradoxically, poor countries tend to have them in spades. These natural resources are what economists call intensifiers. They will help to make a country with good institutions richer, but one with bad institutions get even poorer, precipitating what's called the resources trap. So the Democratic Republic of the Congo is one of the world's most mineral-rich countries, holding most of the world's coltan, which every mobile phone has a bit of inside. But natural resource wealth helps elites to grab money without requiring the cooperation of the whole society. If the only way to grow wealthy is to assemble high-tech aero engines, for example, you're going to need your whole society to buy into the project. But if you just need to extract a few minerals, you can do so with a small labor force, some guns, and an airstrip long enough to ferry your loot out to market. The wealth from coltan keeps DRC armed rebels in guns and corrupts every level of society. So how should one weigh up the relative importance of all these different factors, institutional, cultural, and geographic, in determining the wealth of nations? There's no hard and fast rules, but as a guide one can suggest that 50% of a nation's wealth comes down to the state of its institutions, 20% is due to its culture, and 10% each can be allocated to latitude, connectivity with the rest of the world, and geological good fortune. If you're a policymaker, this discussion has wide practical implications, but at a more personal level, one might take away 2 things from it. Firstly, modesty. You should have a better idea of what you owe your individual success to, which is not so much your own hard work or fine mind, as the broader society you live in, which was produced over centuries and which you now draw benefit from unknowingly. At the same time, sympathy, an ability not to see failing societies just as basket cases, but rather as countries facing comprehensible and hugely difficult problems. Our sympathy can be enhanced by reflecting that the troubles of desperate lands are to a considerable extent to do with malaria, a lack of navigable river, and the horrific buzzing of the tsetse fly, rather than always some more intimate human failing, which we would ourselves never manifest.
Why are some countries rich and others poor? I mean, it sounds like an easy question, but nothing could be further from the truth here. In fact, the origin of wealth is one of the key issues, if not the most important issue in political debates.
There are 3.5 million more women living in poverty today than when the president took office. We don't have to live like this.
I want to give middle-class families and folks who are striving to get in the middle class some relief.
Are the poor countries poor because there are rich countries? Do the richest countries have any special geographical characteristics that determine their success? Are natural resources the source of wealth? Are their inhabitants smarter? Or, most importantly of all, is there some limited amount of wealth that we simply have to distribute?
Porque se insultante opulencia al lado de la más intolerable miseria e indecente es
Well, dear viewer, if the answer to all of those questions was yes, then we could say that our luck is set and we simply can't change it. If we're rich, great, and if we're poor, apparently there are only two paths. Either we quit or we put our trust in some sort of messianic leader who promises us some kind of revolution. Of course, these revolutions, well, they almost always end up making things much worse.
Nosotros no queremos ser ricos. Ser rico es malo. Es inhumano.
But just hold on a moment, because I actually think that this approach is missing something. Well, honestly, I think it's missing rather a lot of things. Obviously, folks, many factors determine whether a country is rich or whether it is poor. And in this video, we're going to focus on one of the factors. In fact, probably one of the most important issues of all. And we'll do so by taking a look at the history of the entire American continent. So listen up.
America versus America.
America. One continent, two very different realities. Some countries are very rich and others very poor. For example, check out Canada's per capita income. Even taking price difference into account, it is 5 times that of El Salvador or Ecuador. Then consider the fact that the per capita income in the US is 4 times higher than it is in Colombia. Yes, it's true, and there's also a group of countries that we could describe in relative terms as sort of middle class. We've got Chile and Panama. Their income is 3 times that of Bolivia and almost double that of Peru. However, broadly speaking, of the 1 billion people living in the Americas, approximately 40% live in some of the richest countries in the world, mainly the United States and Canada. Meanwhile, the other 60% of Americans live in countries that are either very poor or are still developing. And of course, faced with this panorama, the question is, why on earth is there such a contrast between the two great North American powers and the rest of the continent? Or even, why are the countries located at both ends of the continent generally richer? Well, just check out this map. The countries that are painted with a darker color are richer. However, it may be easier to notice the enormous difference right on the border that you're seeing. Donald Trump's favorite border, of course, the one between the United States and Mexico. On the north side of the border, we do have the US, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. A country where, in general, its inhabitants are much richer and much safer, and they live longer lives than those on the southern side of the border, those who live in Mexico. In fact, one crosses the border and suddenly everything changes. But why such a difference? Well, because at the end of the day, we're talking about territories that have a very similar population and natural resources. Don't forget that much of California, Texas, and New Mexico, some of these states which, by the way, are the most prosperous and innovative in the United States, were Mexican at the beginning of the 19th century. And the people who manage to cross from south of the border to the north have quite high employment and entrepreneurship rates, so of course we're not talking about racial or religious motives here. But then why on earth does this huge contrast exist between the north and the south of the border? Well, you might be thinking right now that obviously it's because they've had worse governments and worse politicians. But, I mean, where did that come from? Did almost all the countries south of the US-Mexico border just simply have this sort of bad luck? Is there not another factor involved? Well, listen up here.
Different destinations.
Dear viewer, to continue in the video today, we really need to take a small trip. We need to go back to the year 1600. Imagine there are 2 brothers, John and Peter, who are about to embark on the American adventure from some European port. However, due to fate, they end up on different boats. One of the brothers, John, left in search of fortune in Mexico, while Peter got on a ship that was heading farther north to what later became known as New England, and today corresponds to the states of New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, and Rhode Island. and you might be picking up now that this is indeed one of the richest areas in the United States. Now the question is, if you'd been in these two brothers' places, which ship would you have preferred? The one that was going to Mexico or the one that was going to New England, to Boston? Well, dear viewer, for those of you who answered Boston, I think you should rather reconsider your decision. At the time, things, they couldn't have been more different. You see, John, he arrived in Mexico City, a city full of monuments and new buildings, a city that had nothing to envy from European cities. At that time, Mexico was part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, an area of expansive governance that was full of wonders, cultivated fields, ancient civilization ruins, large cities, etc., etc. But Peter, he arrived in a cold, desolate, and unpopulated area, a place without infrastructure, where mere survival was something of a challenge. It was a place where real hunger and true cold were raging. Actually, the Spanish conquerors didn't move further north because there was no wealth to extract there.
The English chose North America not because it was attractive, but because it was all that was available. The desirable parts of the Americas, where the indigenous population to exploit was plentiful and where the gold and silver mines were located, had already been occupied. The English got the leftovers. Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, Why Nations Fail.
In New England, one had to work very hard just to survive. In the south, however, things, they were different. There were many natural riches, the climate was much better for agriculture, and there was a large local population used by the Spanish conquistadors to do endless hours of work in exchange for practically nothing. The fact is that all these resources meant that many of those who arrived didn't have to work in order to survive. And not only that, many of the institutions that existed in old Europe could be easily replicated. These were institutions like the aristocracy and bureaucracy, that is, the officials or the royal favors, which were privileges granted by the state and which benefited only a select few. These included things like commercial monopolies, land distribution, mining exploitation, etc. That way, little by little, on the one hand, a culture was born in which work and entrepreneurship were not perceived as the best way to prosper. Instead, people just needed to make good connections with those who were in power. I mean, why risk investing when you can just hold out your hand for a handout? And then on the other hand, an elite class was formed by people who lived based on the resources that others extracted. They lived through privileges, forced exploitation of the natives, land distribution, concessions, public revenues, taxes, etc. This was an elite class, by the way, which, based on the standards of the time, lived at full speed, which meant having to extract more and more resources from the others. This meant that this elite group that controlled the economic resources not only didn't have to worry about investing, innovating, or taking risks, they actually placed obstacles for other people. And, dear viewer, this culture didn't disappear with independence, it simply remained, consolidating some of the most remarkable characteristics of Latin America. An elite class with a lot of wealth that is based on obtaining rent, overlords, a lot of bureaucracy, and a shattered social elevator. Meanwhile, in the north, things were going completely differently.
The survival.
Unlike what happens in the south, the north had no resources and no indigenous population to exploit, so there was no other option but to work hard, invest, and innovate in order to improve the standard of living. Thus, the social climate and the institutions that were developed were very, very different. Physical, hard work was well regarded. And not only that, since these territories were very poor and practically depopulated, they had a lot of political and economic autonomy. Actually, at first, the British Crown didn't really care much about these colonies. They were more concerned about what was happening in other parts of the empire where things were more lucrative. In fact, it was only when these colonies began to prosper that the Crown started to pay attention to them. This means that the Crown began to establish political and economic controls, as well as introduce taxes. And as we all know, these settlers didn't take that lying down. See, it's often said that the US War of Independence was a fight to obtain freedom. However, many of the incentives that led them to fight had more to do with maintaining the freedom that they were already used to and which they were no longer willing to give up. Hence, once they obtained their independence, they worried a lot about making sure that neither their liberties nor their entrepreneurial capacities were at risk. But some of you might be thinking right now, well, Simon, hold on a minute, because you're forgetting about slavery. Well, actually, I'm not, because the slave states, they weren't actually the richest. Slavery enriched a few at the great expense of others. Of course, if instead we talked about two companies instead of two brothers, in the long term, it would have been much better to invest in the one in Boston. The keys to development, they don't lie in the natural resources of a country or in the exploitation of anyone. They lie in ingenuity, entrepreneurial spirit, and in work. That's why when politicians make this process difficult, for example with taxes, a strong state, a lot of bureaucracy or privileges for their friends, the results, they're always really bad. In a way, it's similar to what happens with the natural resources. They can help, but they aren't enough to generate real wealth. There are very rich countries that hardly have any natural resources, like Japan or Singapore, and others with many resources but are incredibly poor, like Venezuela. Ingenuity, work, and capital are more important than any natural resource.
That's
The
right.
good news here is that poverty, it's not determined, and you can escape it. Trajectories such as those seen in countries like Chile or Panama in recent decades show that things absolutely can change. But now is your turn. Do you think we'll soon see an economic takeoff in Latin America? Well, leave your answer in the comments below, as well as in this survey. And I also really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. And as always, thank you for watching. One of the most surprising things about Japan, and there are many surprising things, is quite how safe it is. See, Japan is one of the few countries in the world where you can leave an iPhone 10 in a coffee shop, and the only thing you've got to worry about is dropping by the next day to get it. Because to view it, it is almost certain that your recently released brand new iPhone 10 will be there waiting for you the next day. And I'm not even exaggerating here. Also, Japan is a beautiful country with amazing sights where everything seems to be exactly where it should be. But as you know, this is not a travel channel, and this video is indeed not sponsored by Japan's Ministry of Tourism. So let us get right to the point here. Recently, we all found out that Emperor Akihito has decided to abdicate.
The Emperor of Japan will step down on April 30th, 2019, the first abdication by a Japanese monarch in 2 centuries.
Well, see, this emperor came to the throne almost 30 years ago in 1989, just when the Great Japanese Crisis began. So, no, in Japan, the emperor has no power, so Akihito wasn't responsible, but don't say that can't be just coincidence and bad luck. We can practically say that it was after Akihito's arrival that 30 years of stagnation began. And in this video, we're going to see what happened, what caused this great crisis, and why the German economic model has managed to defeat the Japanese model. But first, dear viewer, let's have a small history lesson.
Miracles exist.
Japan and Germany are two very interesting countries with a lot in common and also many differences. After the Second World War, both countries were literally in ruins. They had lost not only their infrastructure, but also an entire generation. However, despite this, between the 1950s and the 1970s, both countries experienced such a powerful takeoff that in those 2 decades they not only managed to recover, but become 2 of the largest economies in the world, as well as 2 of the richest countries. In fact, even though it might seem incredible today, for years it was speculated that Japan could surpass even the United States as the world's largest economy, and oh, how things have changed. The fact is that between 1955 and 1973, Japan grew at an average rate of 9% a year, and between 1973 and 1990, above 4%. These are really, truly incredible rates. And Germany didn't stay behind. It had an average growth rate of 7% for almost 30 years. Both countries were at full throttle, their factories worked tirelessly, there was no unemployment, and both Germans and the Japanese saved and invested their money all over the world. Suddenly, Japanese and German companies became famous worldwide. This was very important, especially for Japan, a country that lives constantly under nature's threat. Besides being a very mountainous country, Japan suffers from all kinds of natural disasters, earthquakes, cyclones, tsunamis, etc., etc., etc. By the way, in a future Visualpolitik video, hit subscribe, we're going to tell you all about how these two economic miracles took place. Well, the fact is that in 1989, this entire economic takeoff stopped. It came to an end and gave way to what is known as the Great Japanese Stagnation.
Forget Greece. Japan is the world's real economic time bomb. Christopher Matthews, an Axios reporter.
I'm pretty convinced this isn't news to you, as it isn't strange to hear people talk about Japan along with the word crisis. Yet ever since I can recall, Japan has been the country of eternal crisis, the country that has one good year for every 3 bad ones. In fact, nowadays we can easily declare Germany the winner in the growth race that both countries maintained for decades. See, today Germany, which has also gone through some bad times in recent decades, is richer, has healthier public accounts, is more competitive internationally, and has higher wages. To get an idea of Japan's situation, I think we can use 2 very revealing facts. First, in Japan, real wages, which take into account inflation, are lower today than salaries back in 1990, which was 30 years ago. And second, the Japanese government's public debt is the highest in the world, 250% of GDP. Yes, we didn't screw that up. That is really the debt figure. So, Divya, you might now be wondering, well, what the hell happened? What made the German model so much better than the Japanese? Well, obviously there are lots of reasons, but we believe that 3 of them are by far the most important. So we're going to take a look at them right now.
A problematic model.
First, we can say that there was a big difference between Japan and Germany's development. The country of the rising sun opted to protect large industrial conglomerates, the Keiretsu. The Keiretsu are, so to speak, holdings that do practically everything. That is, they have companies for all kinds of things. Cars, planes, tires, even toothpaste. Everything is manufactured by the same holding company, whose companies support each other, buy and sell products between themselves, and even have their own banks to finance themselves. So, what's the problem with this? Well, these large conglomerates tended to be very bureaucratic and not very flexible. So decision-making was a very difficult and slow process. But the Japanese government decided to compensate them for all of these disadvantages and didn't hesitate to give the Keiretsu all kinds of advantages and privileges. For example, Japan's central bank financed them generously at abnormally low rates through specific programs. However, the results, they were not good. See, these large groups became very influential in the country's politics. They also had many problems because, of course, when one of these conglomerates' companies did badly, it was extremely easy for them to infect the rest. They were also in a lot of debt, and they even limited competition. I mean, how can one compete with such groups if they are also protected by the government and have all kinds of privileges? It's a pretty hard thing to ask. On the other hand, in Germany, the political commitment was completely different and focused on creating a very competitive market with small and medium-sized companies. But are there large industrial groups in Germany? Well, of course there are, and that's a good thing as long as they don't depend on the government or receive privileges that impede competition. So while Germany's companies thrived, Japan's large conglomerates have had many problems, and most have disappeared or broken down at some point. But that's not all.
The discount policy.
For years, Japanese politicians thought that in order to export more, devaluing the currency from time to time was not a bad thing. However, in 1985, the real problems began. See, as a result of all these currency wars, the United States gained a fairly large external deficit. And because Washington politicians of the time, as they do now, didn't like it, they forced the so-called Plaza Accord, an agreement between the United States, Japan, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, to depreciate the dollar to decrease the trade deficit. As you can imagine, this was a huge blow to the Japanese industry, who was used to competing with a little bit of help. And then the government sank its interest rates and began boosting credit like there was no tomorrow. And the result of this, well, that was a huge debt spiral, banks distributing money like crazy, and a massive bubble in the real estate and financial markets. And you know what happened next? Well, in 1990, this entire house of cards began to collapse. In Germany, however, as we also saw here at Visualpolitik, the government opted to maintain a strong mark, their currency at the time, which on one hand forced companies to compete in productivity and innovation, but on the other allowed them to buy foreign technology and machines under better terms. But, dear viewer, there is still a third and determinant difference.
Locked within themselves.
Japan is the most elderly country in the world, just over 25% of its population, that is. But in the last few decades, one country has stood out of that crowd, and that country, well, it's China. For its huge size and the speed at which this country is growing, China deserves to be given the chief role in this superproduction that is changing our planet. But wait just a second. Let's not rush into this whole thing. China, it's certainly not perfect. Indeed, the country has some pretty